it's arguably the case that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 is one of the most important discoveries related to the history of the Bible and the religion of the Jews in late antiquity, as well as early Christianity of the 20th century, if not perhaps much of the history of modernity. And there is no one, in my opinion, who can speak more authoritatively about the meanings of the Dead Sea Scrolls than Lawrence Schiffman. Let me point out to you that he has published extensively, more than 150 chapters, essays, and articles on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He has been involved in every major project involving the scrolls for much of the past 25 years. And indeed, I think his book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I brought my paperback copy in, their true meaning for Judaism and Christianity, is one of the very best books ever written about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Please welcome Professor Lawrence Schiffman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, that I'm very appreciative of the wonderful introduction. And I guess I should thank all of you for coming, because when you go across the country, leaving the house at 5:30 a.m., and you can figure the extra 3 hours, etc., you like to know that someone cared and wanted to come, was interested in what you're talking about, and that someone cared to make known that you'd be here. So I thank all of you, and I'm honored to be here, and honored that so many of you decided to come this evening. We might need to dim the lights a little, right? The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, contrary to the way most people usually tell it, did not start with that rather famous Bedouin boy who went into the cave in 1947. It really started in the period of the late 1900s with the discovery of something called the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza was a storehouse of Hebrew manuscripts that came from the synagogue in Fustat in Old Cairo. And in the late 19th century, it had started to come, so to speak, into the academic world with these various fragmentary manuscripts. And it was Solomon Schechter in 1897 who went from Cambridge University to Cairo and brought back the rest of this whole enormous treasure trove of Hebrew manuscripts. Now, in these manuscripts, Schechter found among them two particular manuscripts of a text that we now call the fragments of a Tzadokite work. It's also called the Damascus document because virtually every Dead Sea Scroll has two names. In any case, this text existed in one fragmentary manuscript from the 8th or 9th century, and in another manuscript from the 9th or 10th. This document was published by Schechter in 1911. And this document, actually, we now know, was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved here in medieval manuscripts. Now, when this text was published, it set off the entire debate that we know of as the debate over the Dead Sea Scrolls. Initially, there were those who were convinced that these must be the documents of early Christians, that they must be the documents of the Pharisees, that sect of Jews who were the forerunner of the Talmudic rabbis, that they might be instead from the Sadducees, the high priestly group, or the Essenes, which of course are the group that most scholars do associate as the authors of the scrolls. And finally, it was even suggested that they might stem from a medieval group known as the Karaites, a literalist Jewish sect that came into existence in the 8th century. Now, this debate went on virtually uninterrupted in scholarly literature until the period, could we lower that spotlight on here? Until the period about the, essentially almost the eve of the Holocaust. And at that point, the action shifted to this area over here, which is where you have the caves in the location we know of Qumran, which is not very far from Jerusalem, which is right over here. Now, of course, this is the place that is now so famous because it's here that at a place we now term Cave 1 at Qumran on the shore of the Dead Sea, that a Bedouin boy went into the cave, and having entered the cave, found these jars, and in the jars, wrapped in cloths, were a series of scrolls known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, this event, of course, triggered the entire history of research in this field, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, now something which is about 50 years old. Now, as soon as the scrolls were discovered, they came into the hands from the Bedouin who had found them of an antiquities dealer, shown here, named Kondo, with a friend of his whose name was George Isaiah. Now, what happened was that this fellow got, of the original 7 scrolls, they were divided essentially into 2 lots. And 3 scrolls went to Kondo, and the other 4 went to this fellow here, Athanasius Samuel, who was the Syrian metropolitan, the head of the Syrian church in Jerusalem. Now, Athanasius Samuel would eventually sell his scrolls to Israel and then live happily ever after in Lodi, New Jersey, on the $250,000 that he got for it. Now, the lot in the hands of Kondo was sold to Professor Elazar Sukenik, who was the founder of the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University, and he's the father of Yigael Yadin, whom we will meet in a second. Now, Sukenik got very lucky with the scrolls, because previous to the scrolls, he had had the opportunity to excavate the Beit Alpha synagogue, which many people may have seen if they've been on a trip to Israel. This kibbutz in 1929 was digging a foundation for a dining room, and they came upon a synagogue mosaic from like the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. But in any case, after that, he was sort of sitting around waiting to see what he could do at his newly found institute, and got pretty lucky when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Now, Athanasius Samuel, as I mentioned to you, held on to his scrolls and attempted to market them for years in the United States, until in 1954, Yigael Yadin, who would become Israel's leading archaeologist and also was very, very well known as a military commander during the 1948 war, and later as basically a kind of assistant prime minister under Menachem Begin. So Yadin was in Baltimore giving a series of lectures, and a friend of his informed him that the Wall Street Journal had an ad that you could buy Dead Sea Scrolls for $250,000. And he then bought them for the state of Israel, so that by 1954, the 7 original scrolls that had been discovered were in the hands of the state of Israel. All of those were quickly published, and they have absolutely nothing to do with the publication fight that you may remember from the 80s and early 90s, and from all those accusations about the Dead Sea Scrolls not being published. Let me, by the way, point out right now, before we go on, that all of the Dead Sea Scrolls now are published in commentaries and editions of Hebrew text and English translation. There is nothing hidden, nowhere, not by the State of Israel, not by the Vatican, not by anybody else, certainly not by me, and I have no scrolls in my pocket that haven't been published.